Silent Hill is the absolute embodiment of what I personally consider perfect horror. It's a profoundly unorthodox and provocatively haunting emotional disembowelment that uses fear to both scare and comfort you. At its core, Silent Hill was trying to deviate from what most of the genre was trying to do at the time, and instead of bombarding you with jump scares and escalating action to the point that it nullified the horror, it went for a more meditative approach of having the central protagonist explore the quiet, eerie town of Silent Hill before pulling them into its insidious otherworld plagued with monstrosities that served as a manifestation of grief, guilt, trauma, fear, you name it, there was probably a monster to represent it. It definitely bordered on being a little pretentious at times because, while it certainly absorbed you into its brutally captivating stories, it was admittedly a little bit schlocky, which to be fair was a product of most video games at the time and only served to add to its overall charm, although when up against its competition, Silent Hill was like a finely aged whiskey next to Resident Evil's, I don't know, what's a trashy drink? White wine sangria, sure, why not? Anyway, the point of this analogy is this: while Silent Hill swayed towards the culturally sophisticated side of art, you could say, games like Resident Evil on the other hand were just aiming to be a cheeky wee bit of fun without all the introspect. The thing was, while the Silent Hill series may have struggled to hold its drink at times and later switched out whiskey for pure vodka, it certainly kept its distance from the mainstream under the direction of Team Silent, who, prior to their separation, were given a surprising amount of creative freedom despite the capitalist tyranny that Konami is infamously known for. You've likely heard all the production stories before, and there are plenty of videos covering the ins and outs of Silent Hill's development history that there really isn't much point in me regurgitating any of it, but after Konami inevitably agreed to capitalize on the mainstream by giving the film rights of the series to writer-director Christoph Gans, what we ended up with were two very distinct attempts to capture the same profound and poignant magic that Team Silent put their hearts and souls into crafting. Neither was a seasoned whiskey drinker. In fact, you could say one was a wannabe gin drinker, and the other was on pure friggin' moonshine. So, let's talk about it. So let's get this out of the way. Just because this movie looks like Silent Hill doesn't mean it is Silent Hill, because while it isn't exactly the most difficult aesthetic to replicate, its storytelling on the other hand requires a fair bit of restraint and attention to detail. I wouldn't say the first Silent Hill movie is bad, I think it's serviceable at best and tedious at worst. Really, it all boils down to a shallow imitation of the first game where, despite nailing the look of the original series and adding its own unique twists like the snow being ash and the creepy otherworld transition scenes, which were so effective they ended up being used in later games in the series, as well as some awful ideas like Homecoming's weird hostel sequence, it's the overall storytelling that truly brings it down. The film story follows a mother called Rose da Silva as she takes her adopted daughter Sharon to the abandoned town of Silent Hill after she experiences a series of terrifying nightmares, only to discover an alternate dimension where this aggressive religious cult known as the Brethren want to sacrifice Sharon to stop a demonic evil that's manifested within the town and has cursed them all. To both Christoph Gans and Roger Avery's credit, I can definitely see what they were going for with the film, and it is somewhat fairly ambitious, especially considering it's an adaptation of an already ambitious story, but ultimately it suffers from being way too convoluted to the point of incoherency. I'm not going to get too caught up in the pedantics, otherwise we'll be here forever, and I'm not exactly the most seasoned veteran player to break down every nuance of its expansive lore, but either way, when it comes down to it, the film has a lot of unnecessary meddling with the original game's plot, where clearly the screenwriters wanted to embed their own ideas while subsequently trying to faithfully add elements of the original games. Yet, in trying to have the best of both worlds, it ends up feeling frustratingly disjointed that the film could have done with a lot less ego on the filmmaker's part. In the original game, while it's delivered in a relatively complex way, the story is perfectly simple. A father called Harry goes looking for his adopted daughter Cheryl missing in Silent Hill, and ends up transitioning between dimensions, where he learns that the town's cult were trying to birth a deity but failed due to the host Alessa mentally resisting the ritual, causing her soul to separate, with the innocent half manifesting into Harry's adopted daughter Cheryl, and the other darker half remaining within Alessa, causing her nightmares to consume the town, hence why the creatures are manifestations of her emotions. The movie tries to simplify this all down to just pure witchcraft, and yet somehow manages to make it even more complicated. For one thing, the film aimlessly changes the names and roles of several major characters, adds in a few uninteresting new ones, and omits ones that have a poignant connection to the original story. This is what I mean when I say the film has a lot of ego. Despite the director supposedly being a fan of the games, his reinterpretation seems to miss the point entirely, as he tries to overindulge in forcing in his own pretentious plot points that are frankly a lot less interesting than those in the game. In the movie, everything is reduced to a cliche. Silent Hill is now an abandoned ghost town due to a coal mining fire that destroyed it, and the cult go from being Lovecraft-inspired otherworldly deity-spawning fanatics to basic bitch witch burners with some accusation quota to fulfill. Here's the thing, the witchcraft angle is not inherently a bad idea. In fact, if the writers stopped trying to stitch together their ideas and the source material, and focused on the simplicity of the core idea of what Silent Hill represents, there is an argument to be said that it would have made for a more accessible mainstream storyline for a game that's famous for its obscure symbolic elements. You can't have your cake and eat it. If you're going to ground the cult in some witch-burning scenario to make it accessible, and change up all the characters and story structure to the point it's barely readable to the original game, then you can't exactly faithfully recreate the horror in a meaningful way. When you put the story aside, few of the horror elements actually work. I mean, it's definitely got some disturbing moments, like when the ill-used pyramid head tears the skin off this woman, or when they burn Sybil alive. But going back to what I said about imitation, while the design and atmosphere is correct, it lacks any emotional substance whatsoever. It's foggy, but it's not creepy. It's ugly, but it's not grotesque. You pander nostalgia, but so what? It's never going to be as effective as playing the game firsthand, and you've already butchered the storyline so much that you've potentially alienated diehard fans of the series. It's like recreating Picasso because you traced over it. I think people are blinded by nostalgia just because of how accurate some of the scenes are to the first game, but it is completely soulless and superficial when it does not have the same distinctly provocative body horror. Because, well, Silent Hill is supposed to be really fucked up, but obviously movie studios hate distributing anything above an R rating, thus limiting its potential. As such, I know this is a weird criticism, but it feels too clean for Silent Hill standards, and after the third game, that's basically what the series became. It lost a certain edge that was necessary for its subject matter, especially when very few of the mainline games are not inherently about good people. It also doesn't help that the CGI did not age well at all. The film came out in a time when CG was everywhere and preferenced by studios over practical effects, which this film sorely needed. The creatures lack graphic, gritty, witty detail, the town is noticeably green screen that it breaks immersion, and probably the film's biggest emotional disconnect is that Rose is just not that interesting of a character. In the game, Harry literally goes through hell and back to find his daughter, and you feel his anguish and frustration. In the movie, it never feels like Rose goes through the same pain and suffering, and again, it comes back to that shallow weightlessness to everything. Yeah, it looks the part, but it never acts the part. The film even has these unnecessary infrequent cuts to Rose's husband Christopher looking for her in the real world, and they mostly serve to explain the context of the town's abandonment, but all it really does is halt the pacing and bring you out of whatever atmosphere the film tries to capture. I do see what it's trying to convey emotionally, however, the idea that Chris is literally so close to Rose but unable to help her, and I think it even tries to allude to Chris somewhat feeling guilty for not taking Rose seriously when she said taking Sharon to Silent Hill might help her. The basic idea is that Chris thinks Sharon needs psychiatric help and dismisses Rose's plan and now regrets it now that they're missing. On paper, I think it's a great idea that would have played perfectly into the symbolism of Silent Hill, and that even includes how it ends with this bleak revelation that Rose and Sharon cannot escape the fog dimension because Alessa won't let them, because she never had a perfect mother like Rose, or something like that. But again, because the writing is so unfocused and unpolished, it just doesn't convey it to any emotional extreme. The one time the film got a legitimate reaction out of me was when the school janitor who molested Alessa turns into a monster that poisons everything around him. It's the one moment where the film comes close to capturing the genuinely terrifying aspects of Silent Hill, and it's things like this that reinforce why I believe so strongly in simple, efficient storytelling. If this film cut all the bloated crap out of it and just kept its attention on one clear goal, all these random encounters, all the ambiguity and bewilderment would start to have more meaning. However, so 6 years after its release, somebody thought that a sequel was exactly what this film needed, and what we ended up with was, whew, brace yourself. I have a deep, dark confession to make. I honestly really liked Silent Hill Revelation. Don't get me wrong, objectively, probably a worse film, but I think it is so bad that it is good. It is bonkers that this film got released. Hell, it is a miracle that it even exists, because it is so bafflingly strange that it makes the original film seem highbrow in comparison. Up against each other, you could say one is like an art student who tried to replicate their favourite artist but without the intellect to make sense of it, while Revelation is like a bastard sibling who did so much coke that they turned to Reddit to describe their lucid nightmares. I think what helps is that I have a notorious soft spot for schlock depending on the context, and I'm convinced that Revelation was intended to be a serious horror movie, but it also seemingly acknowledges its own absurdity. Here's the thing, Revelation existed simply to cash in on the 3D craze that was everywhere post-Avatar, and I think if they had distanced themselves from Silent Hill and gave it a different name, there is a possible alternate dimension out there where this film has a cult following. As a Silent Hill movie, it is an absolute abomination, and makes me appreciate the original film's ambition even more. But as a B-movie carnival thrill ride, it has its moments, and hell, I'd even argue it's indirectly disturbing in places such as the Uncanny Valley mannequin monster, the antagonist's rubbery fleshy costume that calls back to Tusk, and the baby-faced Jon Snow who clearly does not know what the hell is going on. I know in my last video there were people who said that they liked the Yoga Hosers for being so bad that it's good and I scorned them for it, but I'm a hypocrite because this is my guilty example and I'm ashamed to even admit it. The story this time is significantly toned down to something basic bordering on shallow, yet somehow still manages to be a structurally confusing mess. The plot here is taken predominantly from the third game, where Rose has somehow found a way to send Sharon back to the real world and into the care of Sean Bean, who is now taking her on the run because the town's cult is after them. It actually quite cleverly uses this as a way to revert Sharon and Chris's names back to the original game's Heather and Harry Mason, as both characters are changing their identities to stay undetected. The cult, on the other hand, is now called The Order, which, while better reflects the game, doesn't pretend to overhaul the whole Brethren BS from the first film. Anyway, eventually the cult tracks them down and Heather returns to Silent Hill to find her father with the help of Vincent, who is later revealed to be a born and bred member of the cult and the son of Claudia Wolf, the leader of the Order who wants to attempt the immolation process again. Eventually the day is saved, somehow thanks to Pyramid Head. Harry chooses to remain in Silent Hill to find Rose, and the movie ends with references to Silent Hill Origins and Silent Hill Downpour. Like the first film, it tends to indulge quite a bit on the story, which obviously is not a bad thing, but again, it's just not an interesting one, as it tries to stitch together elements from the games while adding in some mild deviations that don't really do anything. I think its biggest crime is basically just completely ignoring the underlying themes of Heather's journey in Silent Hill 3, which is much more about Heather's coming of age, and growing disillusionment and questioning her identity, which Super Eye Patch Wolf explores in much more depth in his video, so I've left a link below. As such, Heather is just another flat character with very little emotional complexity. At least Rose had a symbolic purpose of being a mother who is God in the eyes of a child, but Heather's purpose was really just to facilitate there even being a plot. Given the 6-year gap where most people probably forgot the original film existed, there was an opportunity to do what the series does and focus on a completely different character with less and less relevance to the cult and place more emphasis on the human journey, but hey, why would Konami put any effort into maintaining the integrity of the series? Like the first film, it does pander quite a lot to fans of the series and does a good job at replicating a lot of the visuals within the games, but the main difference is that while the first film tries to tell its own story, this film tries to have its own style. I'm not personally a big fan of the flashy Saw-inspired montage style of editing, but I guess considering how this film was targeting the trashy 3D crazed teens at the time, it fits that context appropriately. But when you apply the story elements, the two just don't synergize at all. What I mean by this is that trying to force in 3D elements is fine for a slasher like My Bloody Valentine or Final Destination, where gimmicks and spectacles have more of a place. But when you're trying to tell a story like Silent Hill where you have to follow the details, it's easy to disconnect from the story when all the flashy shit starts happening. The film can be more or less dumbed down to set piece after set piece where the words jarring and unpredictable best describe everything. Hell, once you get past things like the mannequin spider, which I still think is legitimately scary, even the appearance of Malcolm McDowell leaves you scratching your head, especially when he turns into a monster. I mean, props to the film for going practical in places, but yeah, that's not what I had in mind. And once you get to the climactic fight scene involving the antagonist and Pyramid Head, you've probably already checked out, so let's just end it there. Anyway, to close, I give the first film credit for genuinely trying to tell something different, even if it does overcomplicate itself with arbitrary ideas that muddle the overall plot and pacing. Conversely, Revelation, it was a thing. It's stupid in every conceivable way and carried by wooden, uncharismatic performances, but if you know my videos by now, you'll know that I was weirdly charmed by how bizarre it was, that it's certainly made for an experience to say the least. When you think about it, the best Silent Hill movie already exists. Jacob's Ladder inspired the psychological monstrosities of the series and applied a profound and poignant narrative around a deeply troubled and sympathetic character who you truly feel anguish for. Silent Hill is not meant to be accessible. It's not just about monsters or the occult. It's really about people, and seeing them confront their pain. And there is so much horror media today that practically copied the series' concepts to the point that it's an established convention within the genre. Honestly, we don't need a Silent Hill movie, because its themes and symbolism are so ubiquitous, whether indirectly or not. Silent Hill has already found a special place within the genre that we see today.